Officer Megan Reilly thought she was just putting a wandering civilian in check outside the 3rd District precinct in South Philadelphia. She let her arrogance take over, pointing a sharp finger and delivering a casually cruel command. You need to know your place. She didn't know that the composed black man she was publicly humiliating wasn't just a local to be bullied. Officer Reilly thought she was just asserting her authority. She had no idea that her recorded insult would ignite a viral firestorm, threatening not just her badge, but the deeply ingrained culture of the entire Philadelphia Police Department. This is the story of the 6 words that sparked a city's reckoning. Will one man's quiet dignity be enough to dismantle a broken system? Hit subscribe to witness the reckoning unfold. Officer Megan Reilly stood near the hood of a patrol SUV, one hand resting on her belt, the other already rising, index finger extended, aimed in his direction like a citation being issued before any words had been exchanged. She was compact with the practiced posture of someone who had spent years making sure people understood who held the authority in any given space. This is a restricted area, she said, stepping forward. You need to move along. David stopped. He looked at her calmly, the way a man looks at something he has seen before and already understands. I'm heading inside, he said simply. Something in his tone, measured and unbothered, seemed to irritate her more than defiance would have. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them with the deliberate confidence of someone who had never once considered that she might be wrong. I don't think you heard me. Her voice dropped, sharpened. This isn't a place for you to just wander around. You need to know your place. The words landed in the open air and stayed there. A passing officer slowed near the entrance. 2 civilians on the sidewalk stopped walking. Somewhere to the left, almost imperceptibly, a phone rose. David didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for identification or launch into explanation. He simply looked at Officer Reilly with an expression that was neither anger nor amusement. Something quieter and more unsettling than either. The look of a man who had just watched someone make a very serious mistake and was deciding in real time what to do about it. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said evenly, I'll be inside in a minute. He walked past her and through the front door. Megan stood on the sidewalk, jaw tight, already composing the version of events she would tell later. The wandering civilian, the restricted area, standard procedure. She didn't notice the phone. She didn't notice the second one. She didn't notice the officer near the entrance, who had gone very still, or the desk sergeant visible through the glass, who had looked up from his paperwork with an expression she would have recognized had she been paying attention. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know that the charcoal overcoat and the quiet Oxfords belonged to the man whose name was already on the plaque being installed in the commander's office upstairs. She didn't know that city council members had attended his appointment ceremony, that the mayor had personally called him a generational hire, that half the department had been quietly watching to see what kind of leader he would be. She didn't know any of it. Soon enough, she would. Before long, so would Philadelphia. The clip showed no sound, just a finger pointed at a black man in a wool overcoat outside a South Philadelphia police station, and 6 words that in this city, in this moment, didn't need any context at all. The comments came fast, then the shares, then the fire. The clip spread quickly across every platform. Philadelphia had seen viral moments before. The city had a long, complicated memory when it came to police and race, but something about this one moved differently. It didn't spread the way outrage usually does, loud and immediate and burning itself out. It spread the way a slow fire does, quietly, steadily, finding oxygen in every corner it touched. The clip played on repeat across every platform simultaneously, No caption needed, no narration, just a finger, a face, and 6 words that South Philadelphia recognized in its bones. You need to know your place. News trucks soon arrived outside the 3rd District Precinct. Reporters in press coats stood on the same sidewalk where it happened, gesturing toward the spot near the patrol SUV, as though the air there still held the shape of the moment. Camera operators jostled for angles. A producer from a national affiliate was already on the phone with her New York desk, talking fast. Inside the precinct, nobody was talking at all. The desk sergeant had pulled 3 officers into the back hallway and spoken in a low, controlled voice about saying absolutely nothing to anyone with a microphone or a notepad. The watch commander had called the district's public affairs liaison and gotten voicemail. Someone had printed the clip screenshot and taped it to the break room bulletin board, not as a joke, but as a warning. It had been torn down within minutes by someone who understood what it meant for it to be there at all. Officer Megan Reilly had been placed on administrative desk duty. She sat in a back office with the door closed, her union rep already on the way, her phone face down on the table in front of her. She had watched the clip herself by then, the way you watch something you were present for but somehow don't recognize, searching the clip for the version of events that matched the one inside her head. She found pieces of it, not enough. Outside, Philadelphia was not waiting for her to find them. The hashtag had been created by a young organizer from Point Breeze who had grown up 3 blocks from the precinct. She posted the clip with 4 words beneath it: "This city never changes." The hashtag spread widely and became the top trending topic in Philadelphia, then Pennsylvania, then nationally. City council members began posting statements. A state senator called for an immediate investigation. A civil rights attorney who had litigated high-profile cases with the department went on a local radio station and spoke uninterrupted about pattern and practice. Reverend Samuel Hayes, whose congregation sat 6 blocks from the precinct and whose voice carried weight in South Philadelphia the way few others did, posted a single sentence on his church's social media page: "We will be outside. Come as you are." People showed up. They came in coats and work uniforms and church clothes. They came with handwritten signs and printed ones. They came with children on their hips and elders in folding chairs brought from someone's trunk. But they gathered on the sidewalk where it happened and spilled into the street. And the energy was not chaotic. It was focused. The particular kind of focus that comes from a community that has been here before and knows exactly what it is doing. Chants rose and fell in the cold air. Candles appeared as the sun dropped. A young woman with a megaphone read the 6 words aloud and let the silence after them do the work. Inside the precinct, someone turned the blinds, but David Harris watched none of it from the sidewalk. He had been in the building since morning, moving through quiet conversations with senior staff, reviewing files, saying little. He had seen the clip. He had read the statements. He had watched the crowd gather from a second-floor window with his hands clasped behind his back, and an expression that gave nothing away. His phone had not stopped vibrating. The mayor's chief of staff, the superintendent's office, city council members, even a reporter he had spoken to once who had somehow gotten his direct number. He answered none of them. Not yet. He understood what this moment was. He had spent enough years inside this institution to know that the next stretch of time would determine not just what happened to one officer on a sidewalk, but what kind of leader he intended to be, and whether this department, this city, would take him seriously when it mattered most. The crowd outside grew louder as the evening deepened. David turned from the window. He had work to do. The meeting started exactly on time because David Harris was the kind of man who understood that punctuality was its own form of communication. The conference room on the 2nd floor of the 3rd District Precinct was not a large room. but it felt smaller. The table seated 8. 6 chairs were filled. A carafe of coffee sat in the center untouched. The fluorescent light above the far end of the table flickered once at the start, and then held steady, as though it too had decided to pay attention. Across from David sat Frank Sullivan, the lead delegate for the Philadelphia Police Union, one of the most politically connected labor organizations in the state. Sullivan was a broad man in his late 50s with the kind of face that had learned long ago to reveal nothing in rooms like this one. He had been in dozens of them. He arrived with 2 attorneys and a deputy delegate named Alex Rivera, who took notes on a yellow legal pad and never looked up. Sullivan opened without preamble. "We want to be clear from the start," he said, setting both hands flat on the table. "Officer Reilly followed standard protocol for a restricted exterior zone. She had no way of identifying the individual in question. What happened on that sidewalk was a miscommunication, not misconduct." David let the words sit there for a moment. "Oh, miscommunication," he repeated, not as a question. "That's correct." David nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is filing something away, rather than agreeing with it. He had a single folder in front of him, closed. He didn't open it. "I've reviewed the body cam footage," he said. "I've also reviewed Officer Reilly's personnel file. I'd like to understand what part of standard protocol includes telling a civilian to know their place." Sullivan's expression didn't shift. The language was imprecise. Officers make judgment calls in the field under pressure. "That's the nature of the job." "The nature of the job," David said, "is to serve the public without bias. That's in the oath." The attorney to Sullivan's left leaned forward slightly. "Commander Harris, with respect, you've been in this role for a short time. Any disciplinary action taken this quickly under this level of public pressure will be challenged as politically motivated, while the union will file immediately." There it was. David had expected it. He had expected all of it. The framing, the legal posture, the quiet threat wrapped in procedural language. He had sat across from union representatives before in smaller rooms over smaller incidents, and he knew how this particular dance was choreographed. The opening move was always the same. Make the institution the victim. He kept his voice even. "I appreciate the transparency. I want to be equally transparent. But this is not a politically motivated action. This is a personnel matter that became a public matter because of what was said and how it was said. The investigation will be thorough. It will be fair. And it will be completed on the department's timeline, not the news cycles." Sullivan studied him for a moment. "The membership is watching this closely. So is the city," David said. The meeting ended with nothing resolved and everything understood. Sullivan shook David's hand at the door with the firm, measured grip of a man who respected an opponent, even while preparing to fight him. The attorneys gathered their folders. Rivera tore the top sheet from the legal pad, folded it once, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. David stood at the window after they left and watched their car pull out of the lot. The call from the mayor's office came next. It wasn't the mayor. It was Deputy Chief of Staff Karen Matthews, which meant the mayor was paying close attention but wanted distance. Matthews was efficient and careful with her words in the way that people are when they know everything they say will be repeated. "The mayor wants you to know he has full confidence in your leadership," she said. "I appreciate that," David replied. "He also wants you to know that the city is in a delicate moment. There are budget negotiations happening, a federal oversight review coming up. The last thing anyone needs is a prolonged public battle that makes the department look ungovernable." David was quiet for a beat. "What is the mayor suggesting?" "He's not suggesting anything," Matthews said carefully. "He's providing context. I understand the context, David said. I also understand that if I handle this quietly, every officer in this department will understand exactly what that means, and so will every resident in South Philadelphia. A pause on the other end, a longer than professional pause. The mayor trusts your judgment, Matthews said finally. Good, David said. Then he won't be surprised by it. He ended the call and set the phone face up on his desk. Outside, the street was quieter than it had been the night before, but the news trucks were still there. A small cluster of residents stood near the corner with signs, patient and present in the gray morning light. David looked at them for a long moment. Then he opened the folder. The folder contained the full personnel file on Officer Megan Reilly. He had requested everything: complaints, commendations, use of force reports, supervisory notes, body cam incident logs, everything. The body cam footage came separately, flagged and compiled by the department's technology unit at his direction. And not just the footage from the sidewalk, that clip the city had already seen, but every body cam recording associated with Reilly over her time on the job. That had been logged under a complaint, a use of force notation, or a supervisory review. There were several of them. David watched them all. He did not watch them with anger. He watched them the way a surgeon reviews imaging before an operation, carefully, methodically, looking not just at what was visible, but at what the visible thing indicated about what lay beneath. The sidewalk incident was the loudest, but it was not the first. Sometime earlier, a body cam recording showed Reilly during a traffic stop in South Philadelphia, speaking to a middle-aged black man in a tone that the supervising sergeant at the time had noted as assertive, but within bounds. The man had filed a complaint describing language that was demeaning and racially coded. The complaint had been reviewed, classified as unsubstantiated, and filed. The supervising sergeant's note remained in the system unchanged. Another incident involved a community liaison from a neighborhood association in South Philadelphia who had submitted a written grievance after an interaction with Reilly during a block meeting. The grievance described a pattern of dismissiveness toward black residents, a tendency to speak over community members, and what the liaison called a consistent posture of contempt. The grievance had been acknowledged, assigned a case number, and quietly closed with no documented follow-up. There were more, each one a variation on the same theme, each one processed through the same machinery and arriving at the same destination. A file drawer, a case number, a closed loop that never connected to the one before it or the one after. David set the last page down and sat back in his chair. This was the part that the clip hadn't shown. This was the part that never made it to the sidewalk, or the news trucks, or the trending hashtag. The clip had captured a moment. The folder captured a pattern. And in David's experience, patterns were always more dangerous than moments, because moments ended and patterns didn't. He called in Lieutenant Tanya Brooks, the department's internal affairs liaison for the district. She was sharp, methodical, and had the particular quality David valued most in people who did difficult work. She was not interested in being liked by the people she investigated. She sat across from him with a notepad and no preamble. "I need a formal audit," David said. "Not just Reilly's. I need a review of every complaint filed against officers in this district that was closed without documented resolution. Cross-reference with body cam logs or supervisory notes and any grievances submitted through community channels." Brooks looked at him steadily. "That's a significant undertaking." "I know what it is," David said. "The union will call it a fishing expedition." "The union can call it whatever they want," he said. "What it is an audit, and it starts today." Brooks nodded once and wrote something on her notepad. She left without ceremony. By then, the woman in the red coat had a name. Her name was Patricia Morgan, and she was a retired school teacher from King's Essing who had lived in South Philadelphia her entire life and had buried a nephew under circumstances that the department had classified as justified, and the community had classified as something else entirely. She had not come to the precinct with a sign. She had not come with a megaphone or a prepared statement. She had come because she watched the clip and felt something shift in her chest that she recognized from a long time ago. The particular feeling of a city arriving at a moment that would either mean something or mean nothing, depending entirely on what the people in power decided to do with it. She had been standing outside the precinct. People stood with her. They came from King's Essing and Point Breeze, from Gray's Ferry and Pennsport. They came from the churches and the block clubs and the community organizations that had been doing the quiet, unglamorous work of holding South Philadelphia together for decades, without much acknowledgement from the city that sat north of them. They came because Patricia Morgan was there, and because Reverend Hayes had spoken, and because the clip kept playing, and the 6 words kept landing. And nobody from inside that red brick building had yet walked outside and looked them in the eye. The signs were handwritten and printed, specific and general. Accountability now. Reform. We are not civilians. We are citizens. How many more? A group of high school students from a nearby charter school stood in a line near the curb holding a banner that read in careful block letters, "This is our neighborhood, too." An elderly man in a Korean War veteran's cap stood near the edge of the crowd, not chanting, just present, which somehow said more than the chanting did. The news trucks had multiplied. David watched from the second-floor window. Then he put on his coat. His deputy, a careful man named Sergeant Marcus Reed, who had been with the department for years and had the instincts of someone who had survived that long by reading rooms correctly, fell into step beside him in the hallway. "You're going out there," Reed said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," David said. "The union rep called again this morning. He strongly advises against any public statement until the investigation is formally concluded." "I'm sure he does," David said, and kept walking. He came through the front door alone. No entourage, no prepared remarks, no podium. He walked to the top of the precinct steps and stopped. And the crowd, which had been mid-chant, went quiet in the way that crowds go quiet when something unexpected happens, and they are collectively deciding what it means. David stood in the cold morning air and looked out at the faces looking back at him. He didn't raise his hands for silence. He didn't reach for a microphone. He simply waited with the same stillness he had carried on the sidewalk until the quiet was complete. Then he spoke. "I grew up 6 blocks from here," he said. His voice was level but unhurried, carrying without effort in the cold air. "I went to school on this side of the city. I learned to drive on these streets. I became a police officer because I believed this community deserved to be protected by people who understood it, who came from it." Nobody moved. "What happened on this sidewalk was wrong," he said. "I want you to hear me say that clearly, without qualification, without the language of investigation, or process or pending review. It was wrong. The words that were spoken were demeaning, and they reflected something that has no place in this department or on these streets." A sound moved through the crowd, not applause, something quieter and more complicated than that. Recognition, maybe. The sound of people who had been waiting to hear something true and were still deciding whether to trust it. "I also want you to know," David continued, "that what I am doing inside that building is not theater. It is not a response to a news cycle. An audit is underway. A formal investigation is proceeding, and the findings will be made public. Not summarized, not filtered, not managed. Public. Patricia Morgan, standing in the front of the crowd in her red coat, watched him with an expression that had not yet decided what it was. "I am not asking for your trust today," David said. "Trust is not asked for. It is built slowly through action, not words. What I am asking for is the space to do the work and the accountability to be held to it if I don't." He held the silence for a moment. Then he said simply, "Thank you for being here. Keep being here." He turned and walked back through the front door. The crowd was quiet for a long moment after he disappeared inside. Then Patricia Morgan turned to the woman standing next to her and said in a voice that was not quite a whisper, "All right, let's see." The hearing was held in the Assembly Hall of the 3rd District Precinct, a deliberate choice that David had made and that the union had objected to, and that the mayor's office had quietly endorsed once the polling numbers came in. The room held people. Every seat was filled. People were standing along the back wall 3 rows deep. The press had been given seats in a designated section to the left. Community representatives, including Patricia Morgan and Reverend Hayes, had been given seats in the front row. Another deliberate choice, one that the union's lead attorney had noted in writing as irregular and prejudicial to the proceedings. David had read the objection, initialed it, and filed it. Officer Megan Reilly sat at a table to the right with Frank Sullivan and 2 attorneys. She was in full uniform, which her union had advised, and she sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her, and her eyes forward. She had not looked at David since he entered the room. David had not looked at her either, not because he was avoiding it, but because she was not the primary subject of what was about to happen. The pattern was, Lieutenant Brooks presented the audit findings first. She stood at the front of the room with a composure that filled the space and spoke without notes. She walked through the body cam recordings, describing each incident in precise clinical language that was somehow more devastating for its lack of drama. She presented the community complaints, their dates, their classifications, their resolutions. She showed on a screen behind her a timeline that mapped each complaint against the supervisory response it had received, and the visual alone. The consistent gap between what was reported and what was done produced a silence in the room that was different from the silence before it. She concluded by placing a single statistic on the screen. Of the complaints filed against officers in the 3rd District that had been closed without documented resolution, the majority had been filed by Black residents. She said nothing after that. She didn't need to. The body cam footage from the sidewalk played next in full with audio. The clip the city had already seen became something different in that room with that context. Several people in the community section looked at the screen and then looked at their hands. A reporter in the press section wrote something quickly and underlined it twice. Sullivan's attorney cross-examined Brooks, probing methodology, challenging the audit scope, questioning whether the complaint data had been selectively compiled. Brooks answered every question with the same measured precision she had brought to her presentation, conceding nothing that wasn't accurate and defending everything that was. At one point, the attorney suggested the audit had been designed to reach a predetermined conclusion. Brooks looked at him calmly and said, "The data reached its own conclusion. I simply organized it." The room exhaled. David spoke last. He stood without notes, without a podium at the front of the room. He wore his dress uniform for the first time since the incident, not as theater, but as a statement about what this proceeding was and what authority was being exercised within it. He looked at the room the way he had looked at the crowd on the precinct steps, steadily, without performance, giving the moment exactly the weight it deserved and no more. Rank does not determine respect, he said. Conduct does. He let that sit. What the audit has shown us is not the story of one officer on one sidewalk. It is the story of a system that processed complaints and closed them, that received signals and ignored them, that had the information it needed to intervene and chose repeatedly the path of least disruption. He paused. That ends today. He announced the suspension of Officer Megan Reilly, pending the completion of the formal disciplinary process. He announced mandatory bias and de-escalation retraining for all officers in the district. He announced the expansion of the community complaint review process to include civilian oversight at every stage. And he announced that the full audit report would be posted publicly on the department's website. Sullivan's jaw tightened visibly. One of the attorneys leaned over and wrote something on a legal pad and slid it across the table. Sullivan read it, set it face down, and said nothing. David looked at the room one final time. This department serves this community, he said, not the other way around. That is not a political statement. It is the job description. And I intend to hold every person in this building, including myself, to it. He stepped back. The room did not erupt into applause. It did something quieter and more lasting. It held the moment, turned it over, felt the weight of it. Patricia Morgan, in the front row, sat very still with her hands in her lap and her eyes bright. Outside, the news trucks were already transmitting live. The union's response came. Frank Sullivan held his own press conference on the steps of the Union Lodge headquarters with officers standing behind him in a formation that was not accidental. He spoke. He used the words politically motivated, due process, and war on law enforcement. He announced that the union was filing an immediate grievance challenging the suspension, the audit's methodology, and what he called the weaponization of an internal review process for public spectacle. He said the membership had voted to authorize a work slowdown if disciplinary action was finalized without full arbitration. A work slowdown in Philadelphia was not a small thing. The last time the union had moved in that direction, response times in certain districts had stretched on non-emergency calls. Community organizations had documented the impact. City council members had felt it in their inboxes. The mayor at the time had settled. Sullivan knew the history. He was counting on David knowing it too. The slowdown began in districts to the north and west, where response times quietly lengthened, and the message traveled without a single word being spoken publicly about cause and effect. It was the kind of pressure that didn't leave fingerprints. The kind that the city had learned to absorb and accommodate and eventually surrender to, because the alternative was always framed as chaos. David's phone rang. It was Karen Matthews. This time the mayor was on the call. Mayor Robert Klein was a pragmatist in the way that Philadelphia mayors tend to be, shaped by the city's particular arithmetic of constituencies, favors, and consequences. He had appointed David because the reform narrative was politically necessary and because David was genuinely the best candidate. Both things were true simultaneously, and Klein was honest enough with himself to hold them both. He came onto the call without preamble. The slowdown is going to be front page. I need to know your position before I walk into a room with Sullivan this afternoon. My position hasn't changed, David said. A pause. David, I need you to understand the operational reality here. If response times degrade citywide, that's a public safety issue. That becomes my problem and your problem simultaneously. With respect, Mayor, if the union creating a public safety crisis to protect an officer from accountability is also a public safety issue, if we negotiate under that pressure, we're telling them it works, and it will work every time after this. Another pause. Longer. What are you asking me to do? "Hold the line," David said. "Let me handle the department side. Don't offer concessions on the disciplinary process. If the union wants to negotiate the terms of the retraining program or the structure of civilian oversight, I'm willing to have that conversation. But the suspension stands, the audit stands, the public report stands." Klein was quiet for a moment. In the background, David could hear the faint sound of the city, traffic, wind, the particular ambient hum of a morning in Philadelphia. Then the mayor said, "All right, I'll hold the line, but I need this resolved before the federal oversight review. I can't walk into that with an active labor dispute." "Understood," David said. The meeting at City Hall happened that afternoon in a conference room on the 5th floor with Klein at the head of the table, Sullivan and 2 union attorneys on one side, and David with the department's legal counsel on the other. Matthews sat against the wall with a notepad and said nothing. Sullivan opened with the grievance filing, the arbitration demand, and a thinly veiled reference to the slowdown without naming it directly. His attorney laid out a legal argument for why the audit's findings could not be used as the basis for disciplinary action without a separate formal investigation conducted under the union contract's specific procedural requirements. David's counsel responded point by point, citing the department's authority under the superintendent's directive and the city's consent decree obligations from a prior federal settlement. The legal argument was dense and technical and mattered enormously because it established that David had not acted outside his authority. He had acted precisely within it and had done so in a way that was difficult to unravel, without the union exposing its own procedural vulnerabilities. Sullivan watched David across the table through most of it, not with hostility exactly, with the particular attention of a man recalibrating. Near the end, Sullivan leaned forward. "What do you actually want here, Commander?" David looked at him evenly. "A department that doesn't generate these situations in the first place? That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have," David said. "Everything else is process. The process will run its course. But if we leave this room today and nothing changes about how this department handles complaints, how it trains officers, how it engages this community, then we'll be back in this room over something worse. And you know that as well as I do." Sullivan said nothing for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen and said, "Show me the retraining framework." It wasn't a concession, not yet. But it was a door cracked open just enough to let light through. David slid the folder across the table. The framework was detailed. David had been building it quietly, in the hours before the precinct came alive in the morning and the hours after it went still at night. Drawing on research from consent decree implementations in other cities, conversations with community organizers, input from a criminologist at the University of Pennsylvania, who had spent years studying police culture, and his own 2 decades of experience inside a system he understood well enough to know exactly where it broke down. He had not shared it with the mayor's office before the City Hall meeting. He had not shared it with the union. He had not shared it with anyone except Lieutenant Brooks, and one trusted deputy because he knew that reform documents have a way of being negotiated into irrelevance before they are ever implemented. And he had not spent time building something real in order to watch it become a press release. The framework had a name. He called it the South Philadelphia Standard. It had 4 pillars. The first was complaint transparency. Every complaint filed against an officer in the district would be logged in a publicly accessible database within hours of receipt, assigned a case number, and tracked through every stage of its resolution. Closed cases would include documented rationale. Unsubstantiated findings would require supervisory sign-off at 2 levels above the reviewing officer. The database would be updated in real time and accessible to any resident with an internet connection. No more file drawers, no more case numbers that led nowhere. The second pillar was civilian oversight with actual authority. The existing community oversight board for the district had been, in David's assessment, a structural courtesy, a body that received reports, asked questions, and issued recommendations that the department was under no obligation to follow. The reformed board would have binding review authority over complaints classified as misconduct, the ability to subpoena body cam footage, and a direct reporting line to the superintendent's office that bypassed district command. It would be composed of members, most of them South Philadelphia residents, selected through a community nomination process, and it would meet in a public session. The union had objected to the binding authority provision in the City Hall meeting. David had expected that. He had built the objection into the framework's legal architecture, citing the city's existing consent decree language, which already contemplated expanded civilian review. Sullivan's attorneys had spent time looking for the seam in the argument and had not found one clean enough to pull. The third pillar was training, not a one-time seminar and not a half-day workshop on implicit bias that officers sat through and forgot. A restructured ongoing curriculum built around 3 core competencies: de-escalation, community engagement, and what David called situational humility, the practiced ability to recognize when rank and authority were being used as substitutes for judgment. And the curriculum had been developed in partnership with the University of Pennsylvania criminologist and a team of community facilitators from South Philadelphia who had agreed to participate on the condition that their input was not cosmetic. It would be mandatory for every officer in the district, delivered in rotating cohorts and repeated on a regular cycle. Some supervisors would complete an additional leadership module that addressed the specific failure the audit had identified: the pattern of receiving signals and choosing silence. The fourth pillar was accountability for accountability, a quarterly review process in which the district's complaint data, response time metrics, use of force incidents, and community satisfaction surveys would be compiled into a public report and presented at an open community meeting. Presented publicly to residents with David or his designated deputy standing at the front of the room answering questions in real time. He presented the framework at a community meeting at a South Philadelphia church. The room held people. He walked through all 4 pillars without slides, without jargon, but in plain language that treated the audience as the stakeholders they were. He took questions. Some of the questions were hard. He answered them directly, including the ones he didn't have complete answers to yet, which he said so plainly rather than deflecting. Patricia Morgan sat in the 3rd row. She asked one question near the end. She asked what happened if the quarterly reviews showed the framework wasn't working. David looked at her and said, "Then we fix it publicly with you in the room." She nodded once and wrote something in the small notebook she had brought with her. The union ratified a modified version of the framework. After a final negotiation session, in which Sullivan secured 2 procedural amendments to the complaint database protocol and a phased implementation timeline for the Oversight Board's binding authority, David accepted both amendments. Neither changed the substance of what the framework was designed to do. The South Philadelphia Standard was formally adopted as district policy. David signed the policy document at his desk alone without ceremony. Then he put the pen down, looked out the window at South Broad Street, and thought about the work that was just beginning. The South Philadelphia Community Policing and Accountability Center sat on a corner lot on South Broad Street, on land that had been vacant for years, a gap in the block that the neighborhood had learned to look past, the way you learn to look past anything that stays broken long enough. The building wasn't large, but it was deliberate. Red brick to match the precinct. It was meant to complement rather than replace. Wide windows that faced the street because David had been specific about that in the planning meetings. He wanted people walking by to be able to see inside. and he wanted the people inside to be able to see out. A small garden along the south wall, planted by students from the charter school whose banner had read, "This is our neighborhood too," was now tended by those same students as part of an after-school civic engagement program. The ribbon was gold. Someone on the planning committee had suggested blue to match the department colors, and David had gently redirected toward gold because this was not a department building. It was a community building. The distinction mattered. People gathered on the sidewalk and spilled into the closed-off street. The crowd looked different from the one that had stood outside the precinct a year ago. Same faces, many of them, same energy underneath, but the posture had shifted. A year ago, they had been facing the building, demanding to be seen. Today, they were beside it, preparing to walk in. Patricia Morgan stood in the front row in a different coat, navy blue this time. She had been on the Oversight Board's inaugural selection committee, had attended every public quarterly review, and had asked hard questions at all of them, and had written a letter to the superintendent's office noting specific areas where implementation had lagged behind the framework's stated timeline. The letter had received a written response signed by David acknowledging each point and outlining corrective steps. She had kept the letter. She had also kept her notebook. Reverend Hayes offered a brief invocation that managed to be both genuinely spiritual and pointedly political, which was a skill he had refined over years of ministry in South Philadelphia. The students from the charter school stood in a line near the entrance, some of them fidgeting, one of them eating a granola bar with the focused dedication of someone who had been standing outside and had made peace with the situation. David spoke. He thanked the community first, specifically and by name: Patricia Morgan, Reverend Hayes, the Oversight Board members, the Neighborhood Association leaders, the University of Pennsylvania research team, the community facilitators who had delivered the training curriculum and had done so, he noted, with more patience than the situation sometimes warranted. He thanked Lieutenant Brooks, who stood near the back of the crowd in civilian clothes and received the acknowledgement with a small nod that communicated everything and revealed nothing. He did not mention Officer Megan Reilly by name. He didn't need to. Everyone in the crowd knew that she had completed the department's restorative justice program, had participated in community dialogue sessions in Point Breeze, and had returned to modified duty in a different district under a structured reintegration plan. But the outcome had not satisfied everyone. It had not been designed to. It had been designed to be honest about what accountability looked like when its goal was repair rather than punishment, and about the limits of what any single disciplinary process could accomplish against a culture that had been decades in the making. David said one thing near the end of his remarks that the crowd remembered afterward, that got quoted in the coverage, that Patricia Morgan wrote down in her notebook in full. "We did not build this center because the problem is solved. We built it because solving the problem requires a place to do the work every day together, in public where everyone can see." Then he stepped back, picked up one end of the gold ribbon, and handed the other end to Patricia Morgan. She took it without a word, and they cut it together. The crowd moved inside. David stood on the sidewalk for a moment after most people had filed through the doors, hands in his coat pockets, looking at the building. The wide windows caught the light and threw it back warm and clear. Inside, he could see people moving through the space: residents, officers, students, organizers, occupying the same room without the architecture of confrontation that had defined so many of their previous interactions. He allowed himself a small smile. Not triumphant, not relieved. The particular quiet smile of a man who understands that what he is looking at is a beginning, not an ending, and has made his peace with the difference. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran the story on the front page the following morning. The headline read, "Culture Shift in PPD. How one sidewalk moment changed a department. Below it, a photograph, the gold ribbon, two pairs of hands, a corner lot on South Broad Street that used to be empty, and a city still complicated, still imperfect, still Philadelphia, but watching itself differently now. That, David had learned, was how it always started. Not with a single moment of justice, but with the decision to keep showing up for it. In the end, the most profound truth this story leaves us with is that real change never begins with grand speeches or perfect timing. It begins the moment someone decides to stand up and do what's right, even when the easier path is right in front of them. David Harris could have stayed quiet, followed the usual script, and let the system protect its own. Instead, he chose the harder road: honesty over comfort, accountability over convenience, and courage over career safety. That single choice didn't just correct one officer's mistake. It slowly began to heal a fractured relationship between a police department and the community it was sworn to serve. It reminds us that leadership isn't about the title on your door or the uniform on your back. It's about who you become when no one is forcing you to be better. In our own lives, we all face our own sidewalks, those everyday moments when we can look the other way or choose to speak truth, show respect, and demand better from ourselves and the systems around us. The quiet dignity of one man and the steady resolve of an entire neighborhood prove that real transformation is possible when we refuse to accept the path of least disruption. It starts with small, brave decisions that ripple outward, turning frustration into focus and division into dialogue. If this story touched something deep inside you, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What's one moment in your life when choosing the harder, more honest path made all the difference? Drop that story below. I read every single one. And if you believe in stories that inspire real growth and meaningful change, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Let's keep walking this road together.